There is a man in Japan. His name does not matter. What matters is what he did for 40 years. Every month, without fail, he took a portion of his salary and put it in an envelope. Not a bank account, an envelope. He kept those envelopes in a fireproof box under his bed. By the time he retired, he had the equivalent of about $400,000 sitting in that box. $400,000 that he had worked for, sacrificed for, gone without vacations for. And in terms of purchasing power, it was worth about half of what he had put in. He had saved his entire life, and he had quietly, slowly, almost invisibly been made poorer for it. This is not a story about one unusual man. This is a story about a system most people are never taught to see. Let us start with something that sounds simple. You earn money, you spend some, you save the rest. This is the foundational advice of personal finance. This is what parents teach their children. This is what feels responsible, prudent, virtuous. And for most of human history, it worked. If you saved gold coins in a chest, those coins were still gold coins a decade later. The metal did not shrink, the value held. But we do not live in that world anymore. We live in a world where money is not a thing. It is a promise. And promises, it turns out, can erode without anyone telling you. Here is the mechanism. And I want you to watch this slowly because it is moving all the time, whether you notice it or not. When you save money in a bank account today, a typical savings account in the United States pays you somewhere between 0 and maybe 5% interest, depending on the year. That sounds like something. That sounds like your money is growing. But there is another number you need to hold in your head at the same time. Inflation. The rate at which prices across the entire economy are rising. When inflation runs at 3% and your savings account pays you 1.5%, something very specific is happening. The number in your account is going up. The value of that number is going down. You are gaining digits and losing purchasing power simultaneously. It is one of the quieter cruelties of the modern economy. And here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because this is not a bug. It is not an accident. It is in many ways a design feature. Central banks, the institutions that control the money supply, explicitly target inflation. The U.S. Federal Reserve has a formal goal of 2% annual inflation. The European Central Bank has the same target. Most major economies operate with the understanding that a little inflation, a small and steady erosion of money's value, is good for the system. The logic, when central bankers explain it, sounds reasonable. A little inflation encourages spending. If you know your money will be worth slightly less next year, you are more motivated to use it now, to invest it, to put it to work. That spending and investment drives economic growth. Deflation, the opposite condition, is considered far more dangerous. In a deflationary environment, people hoard money because waiting makes it more valuable. Demand collapses, businesses contract, you get a death spiral. So inflation is the policy, not an accident, not negligence. The official stated deliberate policy of most of the world's major economies is to make money worth slightly less every single year. Which means that the act of simply holding money, the act of being cautious and responsible and saving, is in a slow race against a system that is structurally configured to outrun it. Your savings account is not a safe place. It is a treadmill. And whether you win or lose depends entirely on how fast you can run relative to a machine you did not design and cannot control. Now, let us do some uncomfortable math. The rule of 72 is a simple way to calculate how long it takes for something to double, or in this case, how long it takes for something to be cut in half. You divide 72 by the annual rate. So at 2% inflation, the purchasing power of $1 is cut in half in 36 years. At 3% in 24 years. At 4% in 18 years. Think about that for a moment. If you are 25 years old today and you put $10,000 in a savings account earning close to nothing, and inflation runs at 3% per year, by the time you are 49, that $10,000 will buy you roughly what $5,000 buys you today. You will not have lost a single dollar on paper. Your statement will show $10,000, or perhaps a bit more, but half of the real value will have silently evaporated. This is not dramatic. It does not feel like a crisis. There is no moment when an alarm goes off. It just happens, steadily, like the tide coming in while you are looking the other way. And now consider the person who does this for a lifetime, The person who, because they were told to be responsible, saved diligently for 40 years in low-yield accounts or simply in cash. Not because they were foolish, because they were doing exactly what they were told. But wait, because there is a layer beneath this that most people never reach. The inflation number you read in the news is not a neutral measurement of your actual experience. It is an average, an index, a composite of many different goods and services weighted and averaged across an entire economy. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is the most commonly cited inflation gauge in the United States. It tracks a basket of goods meant to represent typical household spending. And it has shown, in the decade between 2010 and 2020, inflation averaging around 2% per year. But here is what was actually happening during that same period. Healthcare costs in the United States rose by roughly 50%. College tuition at four-year universities doubled. Housing prices in major metropolitan areas increased by 60, 70, 80% or more in many cities. Childcare costs rose by roughly 40%. These are not minor categories. These are the core costs of a middle-class life in the modern American economy. Education, housing, health, raising children. And they were inflating at rates 2, 3, 4 times what the official CPI was showing. So when a saver in 2010 looked at a savings account and thought, my interest rate is keeping pace with inflation, they were measuring themselves against an average that systematically underweighted the things that were consuming the largest share of their income and their future. This is not conspiracy. This is methodology. The CPI measures what it is designed to measure. But what it measures and what a person trying to build a life actually experiences are two very different things. Here is where the story pivots from unfair to genuinely strange. Because while savers were slowly losing ground to inflation, something else was happening. Assets, specific kinds of assets, were going in the opposite direction. Stocks, real estate, private equity, venture capital, things that people with capital, meaning people who had already accumulated wealth, owned. Between 1990 and 2020, the S&P 500, the index of America's 500 largest companies, returned roughly 10% per year on average. Real estate in many American cities delivered similar or greater returns. Private equity, accessible only to large institutional investors or very high net worth individuals, consistently outperformed all of them. So you had two parallel tracks. On one track, people without significant capital, people relying on wages and savings, were treading water against inflation or slowly falling behind. On the other track, people with capital deployed into assets were accumulating more capital, faster, with the tailwind of the same monetary policy that was eroding the value of everyone else's savings. This is sometimes called the wealth effect. The Federal Reserve has acknowledged it explicitly. When asset prices rise, people who own assets feel wealthier and spend more. This stimulates the economy. What is less often acknowledged in official communications is that people who do not own assets feel nothing from this wealth effect, except, eventually, the downstream consequence of being priced out of the assets they were hoping to someday buy. The house you were saving for got more expensive faster than you could save. The investment portfolio you were hoping to start kept requiring more capital to enter. The responsible act of saving in a low-yield environment while assets appreciate is not building a bridge to financial security. It is watching the other shore move further away.
And here is the irony that should make you stop and sit with this for a second. The people best positioned to escape the savings trap are the people who need it least. To beat inflation through investment, you need capital. To have capital, you generally need to have already accumulated some. To have accumulated some, you needed either income above your expenses or inherited wealth, or some combination. The investment structures that consistently outperform, private equity, real estate investment trusts, hedge funds, venture capital, have minimum entry thresholds measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. The 401k and the index fund represent a real and meaningful step toward democratizing investment. I do not want to dismiss them. For millions of people, consistent contributions to a low-cost index fund have been genuinely wealth-building. But they require a surplus. They require that your income exceeds your cost of living by enough to invest meaningfully. And in an economy where the costs that matter most, housing, healthcare, education, have been rising faster than wages for large portions of the workforce, that surplus has become increasingly difficult to create. You cannot invest what you do not have. And if you have no surplus to invest, the only tool available to you is the savings account. The same savings account that is structurally designed to lose ground to inflation over time. The people most vulnerable to the savings trap are the people least equipped to escape it.
Now I want to zoom out one more level, because there is a bigger picture here that most financial content never touches. Monetary policy, the management of money supply and interest rates, is not a neutral technical exercise. It is a set of choices, and like all choices, it benefits some people more than others. When the Federal Reserve holds interest rates near zero, as it did between 2008 and 2015, and again between 2020 and 2022, several things happen simultaneously. Borrowing becomes cheap. Companies borrow to expand, buy back stock, acquire competitors. Asset prices rise. Savers earn next to nothing on their deposits. When the Fed raises rates sharply, as it did beginning in 2022, those dynamics partially reverse. Savers get somewhat better returns, asset prices fall, borrowing becomes expensive, and suddenly the people who had borrowed heavily to buy assets during the low-rate period face distress. In each phase, some group gains and some group loses. The question of which group gains and which group loses is not random. It correlates, with uncomfortable consistency, to where in the wealth distribution you already sit. This is not unique to the United States. It is a feature of modern financialized economies broadly. The tools used to manage macroeconomic stability, interest rates, asset purchases, liquidity facilities, tend to operate through asset prices, and asset prices primarily benefit people who own assets. So where does this leave the person who just wants to do the right thing? I am not going to tell you what to do with your money. That is not what this channel does. But I will tell you what the math says, and I will let you sit with it. The math says that in an environment of sustained inflation, holding cash in low-yield accounts is a slow but reliable path to reduced purchasing power. The math says that the assets that historically outpace inflation require capital to access. The math says that wages for large segments of the population have not kept pace with the specific categories of inflation that matter most to building a middle-class life. And the math says that the system, taken as a whole, is not configured to reward savers. It is configured to reward owners. That does not mean saving is wrong. It means saving by itself is not enough. It has not been enough for decades. And yet it remains the primary financial advice given to ordinary people because it is simple, it is safe-seeming, and it requires no understanding of the system it is actually operating inside. The man with the envelopes under his bed was not making a mistake exactly. He was playing a game he did not know the rules of. He was bringing a rational response to an environment that had quietly changed around him without announcement.
Here is the question I want to leave you with. If the system is configured to benefit owners over savers, and entry into ownership requires capital, and capital accumulation requires surplus, and surplus requires wages that exceed the costs of a modern life, then what happens to the portion of the population for whom that chain is broken, somewhere in the middle? They save. Carefully. Responsibly. For years. And then one day they do the math and realize that the number went up, but the life they were saving for got further away. Was that a failure of individual discipline? Or was it a failure of the system to tell them what game they were actually playing? That is a question worth sitting with, because the answer, whatever you decide it is, has implications well beyond personal finance.